you can start fresh at any moment. During the day, during the week, in a year, you can always start fresh. So today's first Coffee with Casey of 2024, I'm going to talk about the hellish week that I had last week when I was intending on starting the first Coffee with Casey last Thursday, but I was not able to because of the week I had. So I'm going to tell you that story. Hi everybody, it's good to see you. And then I'm going to tell you the 4 small tools that I use to maintain balance through the chaos, and that also apply to different elements of parenting a PDA child or teen. Hi everybody, it's nice to see you. It's been a while since I've been live. So this is our first Coffee with Casey of 2024. So last week, I was really excited to get back into the groove of things. I was excited to get on to our first Coffee with Casey on Thursday. I was starting a certificate course with the Polyvagal Institute to understand how different nuances of the nervous system relate to our children's physiological impacts of cumulative nervous system activation. So it's going to be, good morning, a big week. But on Monday, as I was doing some work, I got a call from my husband because he was picking up Cooper for occupational therapy. And he said, William has a fever, so you're going to need to pick him up from school. So I went and picked him up from school. He was cute and weepy, and, I could tell he was sick. So I put him in his room, he was watching the iPad, and he fell asleep. And I was like, oh, he's so cute, he's like, I had my door open, and then I heard screaming, like, not just crying, but as you guys know, the difference, right, between crying and being upset and, like, full-blown fight, flight, screaming, pain, fear. So I went immediately into his room and I saw he was terrified, right? Like he's 5 and he was screaming, and I was trying to soothe him, and he was looking at me like he was scared of me. And, my cognitive brain, my rational brain remembers like, okay, like he just woke up from a dream. He is feverish, he might be hallucinating. He's not actually, in his thinking brain. But I tried to hold him and he pulled back and he was screaming. And my husband actually was home at this point and ran up the stairs because of how intense the screaming was. And he was like pushing me away. And eventually my husband grabbed him and he started to calm down on the couch. But this was a huge trigger / what's called in the trauma literature an evocative cue. So an evocative cue is like a sensory cue of a traumatic time or incident in the past. So for me, that is when a child wakes up screaming and I can't soothe them from the period of time that Cooper, my PDA son, would wake up screaming. And it was like the moment he woke up, he was in fight or flight, and I wasn't able to soothe him. And the more that I tried to soothe him, my expectation and desire of wanting it to stop, he would perceive that as a subtle loss of autonomy or equality with me because I had that expectation, that demand, and it would escalate. Okay, so this like triggered me big time, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, especially if you have a younger child who you're not sure what their neurotype is, or they're imitating some of the behaviors of their older PDA sibling, or you're not sure if it's trauma or if it's their neurotype or imitation. So all of these things go on in my house as well, obviously. So once we soothed William, he kept falling in and out of sleep, but again would wake up screaming every 30 minutes. And my other big trigger besides screaming is not sleeping, right? Because this was a traumatic experience for me, both as a new mother, but like through toddlerhood where my son wouldn't sleep, right? And again, like many of you have had this experience. So we get through the beginning of the sickness, and then my husband, who also works for the business now, Jake, left for 5 days because every year he goes skiing with his closest friends, and he's been doing this for a decade, and he very rarely gets to do things for himself. So I gear up and I'm like, I can handle this. But then we have 2 snow days, Cooper gets sick and I get sick, right? So it's an absolute shit show. Week from hell. I'm not feeling well. My PDA son is triggered by the internal loss of autonomy and the physical sensations of being sick. He's scared. He's not sleeping well. At one point, I had to bring William into my bedroom and I set up like this humidifier and was like steaming his face, and it was drama, right? It was a week that wasn't great for me, and even though I endured and muddled through, as many of us do, when Jake came home, even though externally I had gotten through the week, I kind of fell apart and I got really mad at him and we got into a fight and it was a disaster, right? And it took me a couple days to recover. Why do I share this with you guys? First, because when you see me doing my reels and when you see me in my work capacity, it can be easy to think like, well, Casey has it all together and she has it figured out, which in some ways I have practice, right? Like I've been practicing this for a long time and I have a baseline I come back to, and that's what I want to share with you guys. But I also stumble and I also struggle, right? So what are the things that I use to support myself when I'm struggling? Okay. So I just want to share a couple tools, and actually I was on the phone with one of my best friends last night and we were talking about these same tools. So I wanted to share them with you guys because she also had a bad week. And we both have sensitive nervous systems, right? And I know a lot of you, whether you're neurodivergent yourself, PDA, anxious, or just have experienced the trauma of your child going through nervous system burnout, I hope that these are going to resonate for you and be supportive. And I will just say, I think a lot of people, both in the online space but in my real life, have just had a really hard January. So I want to name and validate that. Feel free to drop a heart or whatever emoji you desire if that's been true for you, because it certainly has been true for me. The first month of 2024 has been a little bit destabilizing, but here we are back into our routine together and doing it. So the first tool I want to share with you is one I've shared before, but it's just the sentence, "This belongs." Okay, so when my husband was leaving, I was very hell-bent on like doing a good job and like, I'm gonna like rock this, and I did it last year, and like we did all these cool things. I like took the kids to this crafting store where they could buy all these like materials for just quarters, and we strewed art projects, and I like did a really quote good job. But this time I could barely move through the day, right? Like I was putting my son on the iPad with the door open and like kind of half asleep, and like I was definitely thinking like, oh man, I'm not, like I can't put in any effort to do any of these accommodations that I teach parents because I'm depleted, right? So one of the things that I often say to myself is this belongs. Like this part of it belongs as part of my human experience. The crappiness of this week, the sickness I feel, how hard it is, the fact that it's messy and like I'm muddling through and doing just a B+ job in life, right? I'm not eating healthy. I'm not meditating. I'm not doing all the things that keep me stable. But this too belongs. This is part of my human experience. And this sentence was very transformative for me and still is, but especially early in my journey when so much of the pain and suffering that I felt, and I know you guys feel, especially depending on if you're new to PDA, was the feeling that my son's behavior and expression and my experience as a parent did not belong. Like it shouldn't be that way. And so as soon as I could make space for it through my meditation practice and start repeating to myself, this too belongs as part of his human experience and my human experience. There's nothing wrong, right? It's unpleasant, it can be painful, but a lot of the pain is from fighting against what is, right? So this too belongs. And that's something that I cover my heart and I say to myself when I'm resourced enough to remember, but that's a tool that I brought last week. This too belongs. This week belongs in my human experience. The second thing that I noticed, and this happens to me, I have a history of panic attacks and, have to manage pretty severe anxiety and have my own access needs and all the things. I don't talk about them a lot here because I'm really focused on you guys, but I'll just give 2 examples. The morning that I woke up after my husband left, I got in the shower and I looked at my Fitbit, and my resting heart rate is usually 54 and it was 172. And I was like overheated and I could feel my body reacting to the fact that my husband was gone and that I was anxious, right? So that was one thing I noticed. And then the second thing, postpartum was diagnosed with OCD, with intrusive thoughts, when my son was much younger. And these were very intense thoughts, like, avoiding bathing or obsessively avoiding being near a bathroom because I would have intrusive thoughts of drowning him, right? So this is like postpartum. But I still get intrusive thoughts sometimes, especially when I'm stressed. And so one of the intrusive thoughts that I was having, when my husband was gone, was that he would die, right? And so for those of you who are very anxious, high heart rate, 172. I was freaking out. I also had a fever. So when that happened, I reminded myself, my body is trying to keep me safe. Like the thoughts and the body reaction, we can view them as something's wrong and like my body's freaking out, my brain is broken. Or one of the things I learned through a lot of therapy was to think through and think my limbic system, the protective or survival brain that we talk about a lot with our PDA kids, right? So when I would have intrusive thoughts, for example, when my husband was on the plane, I would say, thank you, limbic system, for trying to keep me safe, but I got this, right? And so I know some of you have explored internal family systems, so there are some parallels, but this is just something you can experiment with if this is something that you struggle with, or if you're a PDA, to say, thank you, limbic system, for trying to keep me safe, or thank you, nervous system, for trying to keep me safe. Thank you for protecting me, right? So that mindset shift, especially as a parent, when we have our fear thoughts, right? Like if we're like trying to make the paradigm shift and it's like, well, if I don't correct my child's behavior in this moment, then they're going to end up being abusive and in jail if I don't stop this behavior right now when they're 8, right? So that is a fear of the future. It's a reasonable fear, right? It's something that our brain and our body wants to protect and keep our children safe and our families intact. But we can recognize it and say, like, thank you, limbic system, or thank you, survival brain, for trying to keep my family safe. But right now, I'm experimenting with this accommodation, right? So that's the first 2 methods that I use. The third one is the sentence, I can start fresh at any moment, right? So often we fall off our baseline, whether it is not responding in a gentle or patient way. So the hour before my husband came home, I was expecting him to be home at like 3:45. And he was delayed, not in the sense of like his plane, but the kids refused to come with me to the airport. So my husband got a car home, right? It took an extra hour. That last hour, I was like, I'm not going to make it. Right? Like that last leg of the marathon, and I was losing my patience. and my kids were on the couch, and just like every second I sat down, it was like, can I have some Cheetos? Can I have the remote? Can you heat up, this pizza? Can you heat it up again? Right? It was just like every second it was that like, I need you to do this for me. And I had been in a very good mindset doing that for the 5 days for my son, and especially leaning into it because I know that he activates more when his dad is gone, right? Because that's his safest of the safe. So I'm going to amp up the accommodations, right? But I was losing it at the end, and I was like speaking in a way, to a parent parenting a neurotypical child or a non-neurodivergent child. It might have seemed just normal the way I was talking to him, like, I need a minute, or, like, can't you get it yourself? Or, I just sat down, right? These are things that, like, to the outside looking in would be like, well, that's totally reasonable for a parent to say to their child. But for my son, as you guys know, those types of sentences can activate him, especially when he doesn't understand, like, mommy's been accommodating me, and like, why is she all of a sudden being like, go get it yourself, right? Activate. So the I can start fresh at any moment. I was feeling bad both about how I lost my ability to accommodate and be patient the last hour before my husband arrived. And as soon as he did arrive home, you guys can take a guess what happened. Did I welcome him into the home with patience? All the, look at the dishes I did, and look at all the cleaning and all the cooking I did. No, I didn't welcome him with patience. I was pissed off, and I got immediately into a fight, right? Like, that's what you probably would do too, because your nervous system is tapped. But we both reminded ourselves you can start fresh at any moment. Like, I lost my ability to be patient with my husband and my kid, but I can start fresh at any moment, and it's okay. And that's something that I think is important to remember when you're establishing a new baseline for how you interact with your child. It takes practice, it takes patience. You're gonna mess up in the sense of like, you have the intention to not try and teach or correct or get frustrated in the moment, but you're going to do it because it's hard not to, right? So the final thing I want to say, and this is part of why I'm sharing this so candidly with you guys, is that it's allowed to be messy. Okay, this whole experience, it's allowed to be messy, and sometimes it looks really messy. And my last week was really messy, right? And when we're in the container of the paradigm shift for 3 months practicing, it's messy, right? Parents are going through the emotions. We feel grief, we feel resentment, we're frustrated, people cry on the calls. It's all good. It's a messy experience to change your behavior, to think through a different lens, and to try and do things in a way that goes against most of society around you. So, we can take this literally, like your house is messy, or we can take this figuratively of like the practice of change and the practice of trying to do things in a way that's different from most of the people around you is messy, and learning is messy. So that's another thing that I'm comforting myself with as I, beat myself up about the fact that like, I didn't do all the things I wanted to do. I started a fight with my husband. I missed our first coffee with Casey that I'd email you guys about. It's messy. And sometimes it doesn't look pretty, but we endure and we muddle through, and we get up the next day and we do it again to the best of our abilities. So that, my friends, is the kickoff for 2024's Coffee with Casey. And I forgot to say earlier, as you guys joined, I have time for some questions, which is what I normally do in Coffee with Casey. And just so you guys know, like, my approach is really to think through, like, what's the next right step for this person, because I can't resolve or coach a person through a like comment bubble in the way that, you know, they deserve. But like my approach during these calls is to help you guys identify like what's the next right step to experiment with. So I'm just scrolling back to see if you guys had any questions. I just see no one has it all figured out. That's true. Yeah. Let's see. Yes, people commenting on my high heart rate. I have intrusive thought that my PDA son will die. Yeah. So we can just say like, thank you, survival brain, or thank you, limbic system, for trying to keep my family safe. And then sometimes I even imagine like the little protector in my brain, what he looks like. He's like a very wily Frenchman with like a mustache and coffee and like an Excel spreadsheet being like, you didn't do this right and this is gonna go wrong. And I like bring him a cup of tea and I'm like, thank you for trying to protect me. Very intense French man who smokes and drinks coffee in my brain, but like, I got this. And then I like imagine my like nurturing part of myself. So that's like a little internal family systems work that I've done. Okay. My mom has always said a phrase, que la casa se cae, which means just let the house fall in a way. Yeah. Que la casa se cae. Totally. You can prioritize everything else that will help your survival or even thriving. Yeah. You're welcome. We are glad to have you back and hope your next week is better. Thank you, Liz. Do you and your husband have date nights? So we do, but it took us a long time to get there. So when we lived in Washington, D.C., my mother-in-law also lived in Washington, D.C., and she would, before I had my second son, take Cooper overnight. So from like 6 p.m. until the next morning. This is before I knew about PDA, and this is when we had the masking dynamic where he was a totally different kid at her house. But the second we picked him up, he would be like destructive and violent and all the things, and we didn't understand. So we, in theory, had the opportunity to go out on Saturday nights like twice a month, but we were so exhausted. We were both working full-time in intense jobs in Washington, D.C., and every second we weren't at work, we were engaging one-on-one in a very intense way with Cooper, because if we weren't, he was escalating and dysregulating, right? So that constant need for signals of nervous system safety. And I remember being like, why can all our friends who have more kids than us, like we had friends who had 3 kids and we just had 1, and they would like go out in DC or like see friends, and we would just crash. Like I would also do, like I would go to bed early and I would do chores, because when I was with my son, I couldn't do other things. And I know you guys have experienced this. So then we moved to Michigan and we didn't have help for about, for a long time. And then we had our first dates were actually him helping me record our first podcast in a garage with my friend Katie here in Michigan. And then the second year of our au pair, Huli from Colombia, who now works for the business, lovely, the best. The second year she lived with us, we would go out to dinner every 3 times a month, because the boys at that point were comfortable enough with her, but I would put William down before, so she would just be with Cooper and they would watch a movie. So yes, those would be our date nights, but it took us a really long time to get to a place where we had established enough safety and there was enough relationship with our au pair. And additionally, we tried one time without both kids, without William asleep already, and the combo was too much. So at this point now, we're ending our 3rd year with an au pair, a bro pair, a male. So Cooper loves him, and we've just started experimenting with both boys watching a movie so that we can actually leave before I put William down. So twice a month we go on a date. That's a very long answer, but I know it's an important one because I had that same question of how do other couples actually see each other when they have this robbing Peter to pay Paul situation? Yeah, so much harder to accommodate when you're ill yourself, absolutely. Any advice when siblings are fighting over a toy, PDA or a non-PDA brother? So that is an example of a question that's so complex. So often when we're asking questions about big picture things like sibling dynamics, or what should we do about screens, or should I keep my kid in school? What we're asking about is we want solutions, but what it really is we're asking, what parents want from me is a solution of this is what you should do, whereas my work is actually helping you work through decisions, right? So, once the siblings are fighting, that's, there's no decision to be made. Your PDA child is activated in fight flight, and your other child, depending on neurotype, is upset, right? And so you're already in a situation where you're either in de-escalation mode, where you're de-escalating the PDA, or you're in risk mitigation, where you have to make cost-benefit decisions of who's least likely to be harmed in this situation. That's not satisfying, but that's once the PDA brain, especially for a young externalized expression child, is activated, we can make the decision to stop the behavior if it's harmful to a sibling, which I do. But the part that we have to accept is that when we do stop, either removing a toy, removing the younger child, which can be activating for the PDA, because they don't want to be left, they want the one-on-one nervous system attention, or they don't have control over whether or not the other sibling leaves. The part that parents want is a tool to make the PDA or not activate, but that is the disability, right? So when we do make a decision, and the decision might be to set a boundary, right? Taking away the toy from both of them, taking it away from the PDA child, removing the non-PDA child gently, or removing the PDA child depending on if there's violence. All of those are decisions, and all of those will activate the PDA because the nature of the neurotype is that any time they perceive you're above them in stature, power, authority, making a decision, or lose the autonomy, the freedom and choice to play with the toy in the way that they want, they go into their survival brain and they have a fight, flight, or freeze response, right? So once a person is in fight, flight, freeze, we don't have tools to stop it, and we don't have tools to stop the behavior. We only have tools for de-escalation, defusing de-escalation. Okay, so your question includes both decision making, what should I do in this moment, which is unique to your situation. And then once I make the decision, how can I soften the edges with accommodations, right? Of course you can use declarative language, I'm going to take away the toy now, but that's not going to make the child not have the activation because of the boundary. Okay, so I hope that for you, the next right step is clarity around that fact of I don't have some magic bullet tool that makes your child not activate when you set a boundary. That doesn't mean you shouldn't decide to set boundaries in certain situations, but we would have to work through what your situation is to help you get clarity on whether to remove the PDA or to remove the other child, to remove the toy. Does that make sense? Okay. Are there any good ways to support PDA or self-sabotage? So the most effective thing, I think, to support a PDAer's self-concept is to start having conversations. Well, the first step, I actually just made a reel about this, and I'll post it today. The next right step is starting to think through, how can I separate naming the threat response and the nervous system response from previous diagnoses, from identity. So I coach parents through separating out these different elements and starting to work on, separate from identity and diagnoses, just naming the threat response with your child in moments that are not activated, right? So this is like preemptively, through regulated and connected moments, using tools like declarative language and signals of safety to talk about nervous system activation and come up with a name for it. So like, for example, my son's nervous system name is Venom. It's like a bad guy that comes and takes him over. And so having the ability to talk about that means he understands there's nothing wrong with him. Venom just came. That's just how his brain works, right? And we can have compassion for that, just as I talked about earlier in this live, my protector, right? Or the intrusive thoughts that come. So that's, in the Paradigm Shift program, for example, we spend 2 whole weeks working on this, on this topic. So I won't be able to get into all the detail, but I'll post the reel and hopefully it will get your wheels turning about like, how can I start separating who the child or teen perceives themselves to be and what their nervous system is doing, which is a protective act, even if as parents, it feels like defiance or opposition or avoidance or like really challenging and distressing behavior. Okay, any comments on no eye contact for about 5 minutes when entering someone new but similar? So I think that eye contact, okay, so like one of the ways I think about autism and being autistic is a sensory and perceptual difference where it's difficult to filter out the intensity of sensory experience and perceptual experience, right? And there can be over-connectivity in the brain. So, for example, when I was doing a lot of trauma healing, one of the things that happened to me was my sensory experience got really heightened, right? Where I would hear pins drop, I could hear the electricity, like everything was so sensitive. I was getting in all this input that I used to not get because I was much more in sort of like a dissociative freeze state. During that time period, my husband and I would lay in bed and when we would talk, I would have to shut my eyes because it would be too intense for me to look into his eyes because it was too much input in addition to the auditory input of the conversation. Okay, so for an autistic child or a dysregulated child whose nervous system is activated and heightened and they already have a neurotype where they're getting in all this input that often neurotypical brains filter out, making eye contact with a new person that's not necessarily someone they know or trust is too much, right? Could also be a reflection of like not trusting someone. So I think that's a very natural response in humans. I think it can feel heightened when we have neurodivergent children, right? And so my son does not make eye contact when he's dysregulated, when he's tired, right? He probably makes less eye contact than a typical child, but he's able to, especially if he's regulated and initiating conversation. How do you manage parental burnout when you don't have the opportunity to get out with friends or alone? Well, manage is a very broad term. I mean, I was definitely in a trauma cave for a long time, and I still don't have like the type of social life I used to. However, I think my perspective changed to like, you know, this is my family's survival, and like me being with friends is something I really like and is necessary. And I did maintain Saturday morning walks with one of my very best friends who lives nearby as a sanity piece. But like, I just knew that the cost of me spending a lot of time with friends and leaving my son when he was in burnout was too high for his nervous system over the long term, right? And so I looked at it as like a cost-benefit decision, right? And that's what I teach. That's what I teach in the Paradigm Shift program. That's what I work through as a tool with coaching clients. And it's super triggering because it makes you acknowledge and accept that your child has a nervous system disability. And with disability, we have these trade-offs and costs as parents that aren't present when we're just talking about like hard behavior or parenting, like we're in the caregiving space. So are there any scholarships, grants, or helps accessing content class coaching? Okay, so I'm just going to walk you through what's free, what's low cost, and what's scholarship. Okay, so I have 2 podcasts, a YouTube channel, and Instagram, as well as Facebook. So that's like all free. And honestly, most of it, like all the information is there. Like I share everything for free. I don't hold anything back. But we also have pre-recorded classes between $25 and $95. If you go through and watch the Clarity Masterclass, which is also free, and 70 minutes with 5 PDF handouts, and you watch it and complete it, you get a coupon for 50% off anything pre-recorded. So that brings down any of our $25 classes to $12.50, or our bigger workshop or courses to $47.50. Then the Paradigm Shift program, we do have a limited number of partial scholarships that are available to single parents, low-income families, BIPOC, and disabled, and or disabled. So if you want to email us at journey@peaceparents.com, we can give you that short application. And then our coaching is not discounted or scholarship available because it requires the most energy and effort and personalization of me and our other coaches. So those are your options. So really it like moves up in tiers and cost depending on like how personalized and how much of like one individual's energy it takes. That's how it's priced. So I believe there's something accessible to everyone. But I'm also not the government. I'm not a charity. I'm not a nonprofit. You know what I mean? Like I do my best, but I'm a business. So, you know, I can't replace the government or a medical system, nor would I want to. My PDA son refuses to speak to any other adult besides me 90% of the time. Sometimes I fear he'll end up in jail someday. How can I help him if he won't engage with anyone? I'm a single mom and alone. Okay, so that's a big question. I think the first step is understanding what's going on, right? So like this is based on the perception of safety. And so you're the safest of the safe nervous systems, which is why he'll engage, right? And so that's a reflection of like how good you're doing and what a wonderful accommodating environment you've created to allow him to feel that felt safety, right? But you can't force him to feel safe with others, what we want to do is think about making decisions about who is in his life who could be safe for him, right? So sometimes that requires advocacy and communication and teaching with those around you, and sometimes it means choosing different people that he's around, which can be triggering to hear. But that's the first next right step that I would think about. Okay, my friends, I'm going to jump off because I have a meeting, but it was great to be here with you guys for the first Coffee with Casey of 2024, and I will see you guys here, if things don't go off the rails, next week on Thursday. All right, everybody, have a good day.